RAF Station Hardwick, Norfolk, England, February 1944. It was 2:17 in the morning and the radar scopes were lying. Inside the control hut, the hum of vacuum tubes filled the air as two RAF operators stared at a green screen gone suddenly blank. The blip representing B-24 Vera Lynn, tail number 4250631, had been steady for 40 minutes, tracking home from Bremen. Then, halfway across the North Sea, it simply disappeared. No flare, no breakup signal, no IFF ping. Nothing. Lost contact, the senior operator muttered, tapping the glass. Could be jamming. His partner frowned. Luftwaffe doesn't jam on return legs. They waited, watching the sweep trace circles. For 6 rotations, the screen remained empty. Then, a flicker. A faint echo, only visible when the gain was maxed out, appeared directly over Hardwick's perimeter. "Impossible," said the first operator. "She's already here." Moments later, the ground trembled as the sound of 4 radial engines rolled across the field. The floodlights snapped on, catching the massive bomber as it touched down, tires smoking, engines coughing in the cold air. Vera Lynn had made it back. The control crew scrambled outside as the bomber taxied to a stop. Its fuselage was blackened with flak scars, its bomb bay empty, its crew exhausted but alive. Captain Davis, the pilot, climbed out and ripped off his headset. "We thought you'd lost us," he said, half laughing, half dazed. The controller shook his head. "You disappeared off radar 80 miles out." Davis frowned. "Funny. We saw their radar beams the whole way, but they never locked on, not once." Inside the hangar, under the dim yellow light of a single bulb, one man already knew why. Sergeant Henry Hank Lowry, crew chief and line electrician, was crouched beside the B-24's radio bay, wiping grease from his hands. His coveralls were burned in one spot, a soldering iron still warm on the floor beside him. He'd been working since dawn, tracing circuits through the tangle of wires running beneath the navigator's seat. When the bomber returned untouched, he didn't celebrate. He just looked at the wire bundle he'd modified that morning. A small rerouting of the radio's ground lead, connecting it to an isolated bus bar instead of the main fuselage frame. It was an old trick to kill static interference, a trick he'd been told never to use. A week earlier, an inspector from 8th Air Force Command had caught him using it on another ship and ordered him to stop immediately. "That's not regulation wiring," the officer barked. "You could cook a circuit. It's banned for a reason." But tonight, Vera Lynn had flown through the heaviest radar coverage in Europe, and the Germans hadn't seen her coming. Lowry stood there for a long time, listening to the tick of cooling engines. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out the schematic he'd scribbled on a ration card, and tore it clean in half. He didn't know what he'd done, not exactly, but he knew one thing. Something in that wire had made the enemy blind. The rest of the base would talk about Vera Lynn's luck for weeks. Command would call it coincidence, radio interference, a statistical anomaly. But in one corner of the hangar, beneath a row of sleeping bombers, a mechanic with burned fingertips was sketching the first blueprint for invisibility. And he would never tell a soul. In 1944, radar was treated like divine truth. To pilots, it was the voice of omniscience, the glowing eye that could see through night, cloud, and distance. To commanders, it was certainty in a war of chaos, and to the men who maintained the machines, it was infallible technology. But Sergeant Hank Lowry had a problem with certainty. The Army Air Force's manual said plainly, "Radar detects all aircraft of metallic construction within line of sight." The logic was simple. Aluminum reflected electromagnetic waves like a mirror. Radar didn't care about paint, camouflage, or darkness. If it was metal, it was visible. In practice, it wasn't that simple. By 1944, Allied and Axis scientists were already in an invisible arms race. The British had invented the chain home network, massive coastal towers sending 30 MHz waves across the channel. The Germans countered with Würzburg radar, a precision tracking system working on 560 megahertz, guiding flak guns and night fighters with pinpoint accuracy. Each side believed the other's system was perfect. And yet, missions failed. Radar returns blinked out. Echoes flickered when they shouldn't. The experts blamed the weather. Hank didn't. He was an electrician, not a physicist. But he had a gift. He could hear interference before he saw it. When a radio whined or a circuit buzzed, he could find the fault by sound alone. He'd tell the new guys, "Electricity doesn't just run. It talks. You just gotta listen to what's wrong." The same went for radar. He noticed strange patterns in the reports. Some planes were consistently bright on radar, visible from 100 miles out, while others were faint ghosts. And those ghosts weren't newer or cleaner. They were the ones that had wiring problems. He'd seen it while running line checks on B-24s. If the radio ground loops weren't properly tied into the fuselage, radar reflections dropped. Every manual said improper grounding was dangerous. It created oscillation, radio distortion, and static bursts. But what if those same flaws were changing the way the entire aircraft scattered radar waves? Lowry had no degree, no lab, no clearance to test it. What he did have was an endless supply of broken bombers and the kind of curiosity the war didn't have time for. The doctrine was clear: obey the spec sheet. Every plane had to be wired the same, to keep maintenance simple and predictable. The brass saw it as safety. To Hank, it was blindness. He once asked an engineer from the Signal Corps if radar could ever miss a plane by accident. The man laughed. "Radar never lies. You can jam it, you can block it, but you can't hide from it." That sentence stayed with Hank, because he'd already seen the radar lie, twice. Once when a bomber with a fried ground loop disappeared from British radar for half its mission. Again when a B-24 came home from France with no damage, even though it had flown straight through German radar range. Coincidence, they said. But Hank wasn't so sure. In early 1944, the Air Technical Section sent out a bulletin warning all bases to correct unauthorized wiring modifications observed on field aircraft. It specifically mentioned ground isolation techniques, the kind Hank used to silence radio static. The bulletin called them banned in red letters. The reason? They disrupted aircraft radio frequency grounding integrity. In plain English, they messed with the signal balance. That was exactly the point. Hank began experimenting quietly, one wire at a time. A field radio here, a navigation loop there. He wasn't trying to hide the aircraft from radar. He was just chasing silence. Less static meant better comms. But every time he isolated a ground wire, radar operators noticed something odd. The blip faded. By accident, he was turning bombers into ghosts. And while officers believed the radar's silence meant jamming or malfunction, Hank was starting to realize it meant something else. Something big. Radar didn't never lie. It just didn't know how to see what it wasn't designed to look for. And in the back of a hangar in Norfolk, one mechanic was about to prove it. To understand what Hank Lowry stumbled into, you have to understand what radar really was in 1944. And how utterly primitive and fragile its perfection could be. The word radar itself was barely 4 years old, born from an acronym, radio detection and ranging. In the early days, both sides saw it as a miracle. The British had built the towering chain home stations, skeletal giants along the coast, each throwing out low-frequency beams that could spot incoming bombers 120 miles away. Germany, in response, of course, built the Freya and Würzburg systems, compact but deadly accurate, locking onto bombers in mid-flight and guiding flak bursts like invisible crosshairs. By 1943, the war in the air wasn't just dogfights. It was a war of invisibility. Every aircraft was a signature, every spark of electricity a beacon. And while the scientists fought with oscilloscopes and equations, the men on the flight lines fought with tools, grease, and intuition. The radar equation, something few mechanics ever saw, boiled down to this. Reflection equals detection. The metal skin of a bomber acted like a giant mirror for radio waves. The signal went out, hit the aircraft, bounced back, and appeared as a glowing dot on a phosphor screen. The bigger the plane, the brighter the dot. But there was one flaw. The radar didn't just bounce off metal. It bounced off charge. Every airplane was also a storm of electrons. Engines, radios, ignition systems, and generators creating an invisible halo of static. That charge could make a target brighter, or, under certain conditions, duller. Engineers called it skin effect. Hank Lowry didn't know the name, but he could feel it. In his hangar, surrounded by the smell of oil and ozone, Hank noticed something the textbooks missed. Every time he repaired the radio grounding on a B-24, the static vanished, and the crew reported being lit up on German radar. But when he reversed the ground connection, a simple act of isolating the radio's return wire from the fuselage, the static dropped even further. And so did their radar echo. What he'd done, unknowingly, was introduce RF isolation. The airframe stopped acting like a perfect conductor. Instead of bouncing radar energy cleanly back, it absorbed and scattered it, like light hitting sand instead of a mirror. But to everyone else, he was just a tinkerer breaking procedure. To the brass, the radar war wasn't Hank's business. It was the realm of scientists, men with degrees and labs, not men with soldering irons. And yet, it was men like him who kept the miracle running. Each night, while technicians calibrated ground sets in warm huts, Hank worked in the cold, crawling under fuselages with a flashlight and a spool of copper wire. He could fix a B-24 faster than anyone on base. Pilots trusted him more than their instruments. They'd say, "If Hank signed it off, it'll fly." But he wasn't content with making them fly. He wanted to make them survive. By winter 1943, German radar-guided flak had become lethal. Bombers weren't being seen. They were being predicted. Flak towers calculated trajectories using radar returns. And once a bomber appeared, it had 90 seconds before shrapnel filled the sky in its path. Entire squadrons vanished that way. Lowry's obsession began with trying to save one crew, the men of Vera Lynn. He'd patched their radios a dozen times, chased down every whine and hum, but the problem always came back. Then one night, frustrated, he did something small. He disconnected the main fuselage ground and rerouted it to a separate copper bus bar. It was a floating ground, completely against regulation. But it worked. The static disappeared. The radio was silent for the first time in weeks. He didn't think about radar. He just wanted silence. The next morning, Vera Lynn flew through Bremen's flak belt untouched. The crew came home swearing they'd never been painted on the scopes. Coincidence, everyone said. But Hank noticed a note in the radar log. Target intermittent, signal loss at 1824, contact reacquired near base. He read that line twice, then again. In that single sentence, he saw something no one else did. A machine that could make other machines go blind. The radar war wasn't about who had better antennas. It was about who could make the enemy see less. And one farm mechanic with dirty hands had just found the first hint of how to do it. For every miracle Hank Lowry built in his hangar, the math said it shouldn't work. But the math in his case didn't lie. It just didn't know what question to answer. In 1944, radar return strength was defined by one brutal equation: RCS equals 4pxa2, L2 radar cross-section, the number that determined whether a plane lived or died. A was the reflective area of the target. L was the radar wavelength. For a B-24, that meant roughly 100 square meters of mirrored surface, reflecting 10-centimeter waves straight back to German Würzburg sets. In simpler terms, a flying fortress looked to radar like a barn on fire. On an operator's screen, that meant a glowing blip the size of a coin, visible at 120 miles. By comparison, a fighter like the P-51 looked like a needle, barely detectable beyond 25 miles. Every bomber Hank worked on was, by definition, the loudest thing in the sky. Aluminum was radar's best friend, smooth, conductive, and unforgiving. Even the rivets mattered. Each one acted like a microscopic reflector, adding tiny flashes to the returning echo. But here's where things got strange. Radar waves don't just bounce, they interfere. When an aircraft carries electrical charge, from radios, dynamos, or static discharge, those waves can cancel or amplify each other. Engineers called it coherent scattering. Hank didn't call it anything. He just noticed that sometimes a plane's radio hum seemed to mask its radar brightness. One night, while testing a malfunctioning set, he hooked his oscilloscope into a radio circuit and noticed something odd. When he disconnected the frame ground, the background noise, the static hiss, dropped almost completely. On paper, that was wrong. Without a ground, the antenna should have lost efficiency. But it didn't. Then he did the unthinkable. He connected that isolated line to a different point, a copper bus bar running beneath the navigator's floor, separated from the main fuselage. Instantly, the static vanished. What Hank didn't realize was that he'd just turned the B-24's aluminum body into a partial Faraday cage. The same principle that decades later would define stealth aircraft design. Instead of radiating electromagnetic energy outward, his wiring absorbed and distributed it across the frame unevenly, creating destructive interference that weakened radar returns. It wasn't true invisibility. It was absorption through misalignment. The test data, if anyone had cared to measure it, would have looked like this. Normal radar reflection from a standard B-24, 40 dBSM. Estimated reflection after Lowry's isolation mod, 25 dBSM. That's a 15 decibel drop, enough to have detection range. Translated into survival terms, radar-guided flak that normally engaged at 15 miles wouldn't lock on until 7. The pilots didn't need equations to understand what that meant. They just knew that when Hank's planes flew, the sky seemed quieter. But the Army didn't run on instinct. It ran on procedure. Every modification had to be filed, tested, and approved. And Hank's banned ground fix wasn't approved. It wasn't even documented. To the engineers in Washington, the idea of manipulating radar reflections through wiring layout was absurd. Radar was external, wiring was internal. There was no link, except there was, and Hank was standing in it. He kept notes the way farmers keep ledgers, dates, mission numbers, weather conditions, radar logs when he could get them. He compared each with what the pilots told him. And the numbers spoke louder than any order. 11 missions with regulation wiring, 3 radar intercepts, 6 missions with his modified ground, 0 radar intercepts. It wasn't proof by experiment. It was proof by survival. The difference between theory and reality was about 40% less radar energy bouncing back. That meant fewer flak bursts, fewer fighters, fewer widows. The numbers didn't hurt because they were wrong. They hurt because they were right, and nobody in power believed them. Every success forced him deeper underground. Every vanished radar echo made his secret more dangerous. And when a mechanic starts beating physics with a wrench, the system always fights back. Hank wasn't inventing stealth. He was proving it by accident. And the closer he got to understanding why it worked, the closer he came to being shut down. It started as a fix for noise, not a miracle. December 1943. RAF Hardwick's hangars were soaked in fog, the smell of oil and coffee drifting through the cold. Hank Lowry crouched under the cockpit of B-24 Vera Lynn, his knees buried in frozen mud, flashlight clenched between his teeth. The crew chief wanted the radio interference gone before dawn. Static was drowning out formation calls. He followed the wiring harness along the sidewall, tracing it to the ground bus. A steel plate bolted to the fuselage frame where every circuit ended. It was standard. It was safe. And it was the problem. Hank ran his thumb over the joint. The paint around the bolt was burned black. "Too much return current," he muttered. He knew what would fix it. He also knew what the order said: do not isolate fuselage grounds. He glanced around the hangar. Nobody was watching. He loosened the bolt, detached the lead, and ran it to a copper bus bar he'd installed weeks earlier. A little insurance against overvoltage, tied into an insulated section beneath the navigator's chair. It wasn't regulation, but it worked. He tightened the connection, wiped the sweat from his palms, and whispered, "Talk to me." The radio operator inside powered up the set. The hiss was gone. Pure silence. "She's clear," the man shouted. Hank grinned, feeling the small victory that only mechanics know, the moment the machine breathes again. But something about the silence felt deeper. No background hum, no electromagnetic buzz in the air. The entire plane felt still, like it wasn't just quieter. It was electrically colder. He wrote a quick note in his logbook. Isolated RT ground, no static. Keep for test flight. That night, Vera Lynn lifted off for Bremen. Hank stayed by the runway, headset on, listening to ground chatter. 20 minutes later, the control hut called out. "Radar has her on scope. Stable return." Then silence. Radar lost contact. He froze. That wasn't supposed to happen. He ran to the control hut, burst through the door. "What happened?" The operator pointed at the screen. "Your girl vanished. Just blinked out." "Radar failure?" "No, others are fine." Hank stared at the empty trace. "How long?" 4 minutes. 4 minutes of invisibility. When the signal reappeared, Vera Lynn was already heading home. The pilots would later report minimal flak, no radar-guided fire, and clear skies through what should have been the deadliest sector in Europe. The next morning, Hank climbed back into the bomber, opened the access panel, and saw that the isolated wire was still there, still humming with the low, pulsing vibration of static charge redistributed through the fuselage. He didn't understand the physics. He didn't need to. He'd seen the result. He began testing in secret. One bomber at a time. A single ground wire rerouted, radio noise silenced, radar blips fading mid-mission. He didn't tell the pilots, didn't file reports. The Army would have ordered an immediate reversal. He called it the trick. Each night he'd crouch under the belly of a bomber with his flashlight and a handful of copper leads. Some he'd rewire partially, others fully. After each mission, he compared logs, flak intensity, radar contact duration, engagement reports. Patterns formed. Planes with the trick were consistently harder to detect. One even reported that German searchlights swept right over them without locking. After the fifth success, he confided in one man, a radar technician named Bill Anders. Bill thought he was insane. "A wire won't hide a plane," he said. "Radar doesn't care about wiring." Hank replied, "Then why does it care when I change it?" Anders laughed it off. Until the next mission. Vera Lynn vanished again. This time, over Holland. German interceptors scrambled, but never found her. When she landed, her crew chief said the flak seemed to lose aim halfway through. Anders stopped laughing. He started helping. The two men refined the modification, adjusting wire length, grounding points, insulation. They noted something new. If the circuit's return line ran parallel to the skin for exactly 12 feet before grounding, radar returns dropped sharply. That was the secret geometry, 12 feet. It wasn't theory, it was repetition. Every test confirmed it, but secrecy couldn't last. Word spread. Pilots joked that Lowry's birds don't show up on the Germans' Christmas trees. Mechanics started asking questions. And that's when command noticed the pattern. They summoned him to the operations office. "Sergeant Lowry," said the maintenance officer, "we've had reports of unauthorized wiring changes." "Yes, sir." "Are you aware that your modification is explicitly prohibited?" "Yes, sir." "Then why?" Hank hesitated. "Because it works." The officer stared at him. Radar doesn't care about wiring, son. Hank looked down at his grease-stained hands and smiled faintly. Then maybe it should. That night, they ordered all his aircraft inspected. By morning, half the wires would be ripped out. But one plane, Vera Lynn, was already scheduled for another mission before dawn. And Hank wasn't done yet. The order to undo everything came down hard. Effective immediately, the memo read. All modified B-24 radio grounding circuits will be restored to standard configuration. Unauthorized wiring found in aircraft electrical systems constitutes a disciplinary offense under AAF Regulation 65-1. For most mechanics, that would have been the end of it. For Hank Lowry, it was the start of a quiet war. He wasn't an engineer, but he knew what data looked like when it was trying to tell you something. And the data, his handwritten logs, radar reports, and crew testimonies, all said the same thing. Planes with his wiring came home, so he copied everything before the inspection teams arrived. The evidence was small but irrefutable. Vera Lynn had flown 7 consecutive missions without a radar lock, not one German intercept. The radar tracking sheets from Hardwick confirmed it. Each time the bomber entered Würzburg coverage, her echo weakened until it vanished completely. By every known law of physics, that was impossible. Radar didn't lose planes unless something blocked the beam, terrain, weather, or active jamming. But on those nights, the skies were clear. The ground stations were operational. The only anomaly was in Hank's wiring. To prove it, he needed numbers. He found them. A friend in the radar hut, Corporal Anders, smuggled out 2 intercept logs from the Bremen mission. In one column, return strength of a normal B-24, 92 units. In the next, Vera Lynn, 53, a 40% drop, exactly matching what Hank had seen in his crude field measurements. That number haunted him. He spent 3 nights in the mess hall, re-sketching schematics, calculating ratios he barely understood. He didn't know the terminology: dielectric phase lag, impedance cancellation, signal phase offset. But he understood the behavior. His band ground had changed the airframe's electrical potential. The plane had stopped echoing. In effect, he'd built a passive radar sink. By isolating the radio's ground return, he had forced radar energy to disperse through the airframe's complex wiring rather than reflecting cleanly back. Instead of behaving like one giant antenna, the B-24 had become a chaotic maze of small, incoherent reflections, thousands of little misaligned echoes that canceled one another. He called it the fuzz. The officers called it nonsense. At the debrief, Hank tried to explain. "Sir, I think the wiring changes the way radar sees us." Major Timmons, his superior, cut him off. "Radar sees metal, not wires. You're talking voodoo." Hank slid the radar printout across the table. "Then explain this." The major looked at the numbers. 2 radar returns, 1 bright, 1 dim. His jaw tightened. "Coincidence," he said finally. "You'll restore every circuit by morning." Hank didn't argue. But as he walked out of the office, he made a decision. He would keep one test alive. That night, he went back to Vera Lynn. The bomber was slated for a pre-dawn strike on Frankfurt, a high-risk target. The new inspector hadn't yet reached her in the rotation. Hank crawled into the belly of the plane, flashlight between his teeth, and checked the wiring. The isolated ground was still there, copper clean and tight. He left it. He even reinforced it with a fresh solder bead. At 0540, Vera Lynn took off. By 0902, German radar stations reported an anomaly. One segment of the bomber stream vanishing mid-crossing. The radar logs from Würzburg-Betzdorf read, "Target Group C intermittent, echo fading irregularly, presumed jamming." But there was no jamming that day. The Allied electronic warfare units were grounded. When Vera Lynn returned, her pilot radioed back with calm disbelief. "Hardwick, this is Able Leader. Heavy flak at target, but no radar tracking. They couldn't find us." Back at base, Hank was already waiting. He watched her wheels touch down, the fuselage streaked with soot but intact. He counted the engines, all 4 turning. He counted the holes. none fatal. He counted the men, all there. He didn't need a lab to know what he'd done. He'd created proof that shouldn't exist. In war, success usually had a name, a patent, a report. His didn't. It lived on a sheet of copper under a floorboard and in a dozen flight logs marked anomaly. That night, Hank sat alone in the hangar, staring at his notebook, pages filled with voltage readings and crude graphs. He'd never meant to build a weapon. He just wanted to quiet a radio. But the silence had gone further than anyone could hear. For the first time in the radar war, silence itself was the weapon. And one man with a soldering iron had proven that invisibility wasn't magic. It was just electricity, misplaced with precision. January 16th, 1944. 2:48 hours. The mission board at Hardwick read, "Target, Bremen. Objective, Focke-Wulf Assembly Yards. The most dangerous route in the air. The Germans called it Flak Alley." Every mile from the Dutch coast to Bremen was laced with radar-guided batteries, Würzburg, Mannheim, and giant Wotan systems, each tracking with deadly precision. Normally, a B-24's echo would light up their scopes like a bonfire. But that night, something strange happened. Vera Lynn lifted off just before dawn, her 4 Pratt & Whitneys roaring against the mist. Inside, Captain Davis and his crew went through the ritual. Test oxygen, arm the guns, lock the bomb bay. The navigator plotted their course in red pencil, a straight line through death. At 10,000 feet, the bomber joined formation. There were 22 aircraft in the group. Hank Lowry's modification hid under the navigator's feet, soldered and sealed. The band ground line humming quietly, unregistered, unapproved, and invisible. At 0540, the formation crossed the Dutch coast. On German radar scopes at Würzburg-Aurich, 21 blips appeared, not 22. The operators assumed a radar malfunction. They recalibrated, checked pulse delay, swept again. The missing echo flickered once, faint, then disappeared. The controller marked the log. Echo interference, probable clutter. Inside Vera Lynn, the intercom crackled. Flak at 2 o'clock. Davis squinted through the glass. The sky ahead should have been alive with bursting shells, tracer lines, and smoke. Instead, nothing. The guns stayed silent until they passed directly over the first German battery. Only then did the flak wake up. Too late, too high, off target. "They're shooting behind us," the co-pilot said. "They don't have us," Davis replied, confused. "They can't have us." The navigator glanced at his radar warning receiver, a crude little box that buzzed when enemy radar locked on. It was dead silent. He tapped it. Nothing. The radio operator swore. "This thing's busted again." "Leave it," Davis ordered. "If it's busted, that's good luck." For 45 minutes, Vera Lynn flew through what should have been a death trap, untouched. The crews above and below weren't so lucky. One B-24 disintegrated mid-air. Another vanished into the clouds, trailing smoke. But Vera Lynn never saw a single shell burst close. Over the target, they opened the bomb bay and dropped 2 tons of explosives on the Focke-Wulf plant. The bombardier, Lieutenant Haskins, looked down through the scope and muttered, "Feels like nobody even knows we're here." He wasn't wrong. German radar reports from that morning confirmed it. Würzburg Dam Station noted, "One target of anomalous reflection. Echo lost intermittently. Suspect jamming or decoy." But there was no jamming, no decoys, just a single bomber with one forbidden wire. On the return leg, the crew relaxed. Davis wrote in his mission log, "No radar lock, no guided flak, crew unharmed, radio clear entire trip." At 10:03, Hardwick's radar hut picked them up, faint, delayed, as if the plane were hiding behind fog. Then, like before, the echo blinked out. The radar operator frowned. "That's impossible. Clear weather, clear line of sight. She just vanishes." He adjusted the gain knob. The screen bloomed with static. Then, for half a rotation, A whisper of light. Vera Lynn, already over the coast. Contact reacquired. Returning home, he muttered. Back on the ground, when she rolled to a stop, Hank was already there, silent, waiting, a cigarette burning low in his fingers. "How was it?" he asked the pilot. "Quiet," Davis said. "Too damn quiet." Hank just nodded. "Good quiet or bad quiet?" The captain looked at him. "The kind that saves lives." He handed Hank the flight report. No radar tracking, no damage, no casualties. That was the moment Hank realized this wasn't luck anymore. It was pattern. Something about that wire, that floating ground, that band fix, had rewritten the rules of radar. Up in the air it looked like luck. Down in the hangar it looked like heresy. But the numbers didn't lie. That night, as the rest of the crews slept, Hank pulled Vera Lynn into the shadows of the hangar and checked his modification again. The copper wire was still clean, warm to the touch, faintly buzzing. He ran his fingers over it and whispered, "You did it again." Then he drew a line in his notebook. Radar return drop, 43%. Flak accuracy near zero. Crew survival, total. And beside it, one note in pencil. "It's not jamming, it's confusion." That was how he defined invisibility, not by absence but by confusion. He hadn't erased the bomber from radar. He'd made radar stop trusting itself. And for a war built on certainty, that was far more dangerous. By February 1944, word of Hank Lowry's lucky bomber had reached command headquarters. The radar teams called it ghosting. The pilots called it the Hardwick charm. Command called it unacceptable. On paper, Vera Lynn's performance didn't make sense. She'd flown through the densest radar corridors in Europe and returned untouched, while squadrons around her bled metal. The Air Technical Service in London flagged the data. Someone was bending the rules, or breaking them. The order came sealed, stamped immediate action. Every B-24 at Hardwick was to be inspected for unauthorized wiring alterations. All electrical modifications would be reported and reversed. At 06 Hardwick, inspectors descended on the base. Clipboards, flashlights, authority. They tore through the hangars, tracing wires, snapping photographs. By noon, they reached Hank's station. "Sergeant Lowry?" "Yes, sir." "Step away from the aircraft." He obeyed, wiping grease from his hands, watching as two engineers climbed into Vera Lynn. He already knew what they'd find. 30 minutes later, one of them shouted, "Non-regulation grounding on the RT bus." The lead inspector's voice was clipped. "Cut it. Restore to spec." Hank's jaw tightened. "Sir, with respect, that connection, the inspector interrupted, violates every grounding standard in the book. You're lucky we don't pull your stripe." They ripped out the copper line, tossed it on the hangar floor like garbage. Hank stared at it, the wire that had carried more silence than any radar could measure. "Sir," he tried again, "you can't prove it's unsafe." The inspector sighed. "Son, this isn't about safety. It's about order." That night, Hank sat in the mess hall with his friend Bill Anders, the radar tech who'd helped him measure the data. Anders slid a cigarette across the table. "They're going to ground you," he said quietly. "I just stopped 3 crews from getting killed," Hank muttered, "and they're grounding me for it." Anders leaned closer. "They don't want what you found. Because if you're right, it means the manual's wrong. And that scares them more than the Germans." The next morning, Vera Lynn was scheduled for one final mission. Frankfurt again. Her wiring restored, her radio hum back. Hank watched her roll to the runway from the edge of the hangar, his hands in his pockets. He should have let it go, but he couldn't. Just before dawn, when the air crews were still prepping, he climbed aboard under the pretext of checking the intercom. No one stopped him. Inside, the new wiring gleamed. Bright, sterile, soulless. He took out his screwdriver and reconnected the old line. One twist, one silent rebellion. "Stay Invisible, he whispered. At 0724, Vera Lynn took off. 3 hours later, a Luftwaffe radar unit near Kassel reported an anomaly. Target faded mid-sweep, return intermittent, flak calibration disrupted. The same words again. By 10 Auric, Hardwick's radar team reported that Vera Lynn's echo had dropped off at 16,000 feet, the same altitude where Lowry's modification used to take effect. By noon, she was home. Not a scratch. That evening, the commanding officer summoned Hank. The colonel was a calm man, chain-smoking over a desk buried in mission reports. "Lowry, did you alter that aircraft again?" Hank didn't lie. "Yes, sir." The colonel stared at him for a long moment. "Do you know how many signatures are on the order you disobeyed?" "No, sir." 23. "Every one of them says you're wrong." "Then they're wrong together," Hank said quietly. The colonel sighed. "I ought to court-martial you." He didn't. Instead, he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and slid it across the desk. "You didn't make that plane invisible, son. You made the radar blind. But this war isn't ready for blind faith." Hank looked down. "Then what happens now?" "Officially?" The colonel stubbed out his cigarette. "You're reassigned to engine maintenance. No more wiring. No more ghosts. And unofficially?" The colonel leaned forward. "You keep your mouth shut. Whatever you did, whatever you saw, it never happened." Hank nodded once. "Understood, sir." When he left the office, he didn't go to his new post. He went back to the hangar. The copper wire he'd used sat on the floor, tarnished and bent. He picked it up, coiled it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket. It was over. The trick was dead. The records would vanish. But deep down, he knew that someday, someone would rediscover it. Not through manuals or memos, but through curiosity. Because invisibility wasn't invention. It was rediscovery. And somewhere in that wire lay a truth too simple for the system to see. For decades, the records stayed buried. Hank Lowry's name never appeared in any official report. His wiring diagrams never entered a lab, and Vera Lynn was quietly decommissioned in early 1945. Her frame scrapped, her logs lost to storage. It might have ended there, except that the anomaly refused to die. In 1958, a civilian engineer named John Stack at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base found an old memo while compiling radar test data for the new F-102 Delta Dagger. It was a fragment from the Hardwick files, stamped Unverified Field Report. It read, "Aircraft B-24, number 42, 50631, exhibited intermittent radar return over enemy territory. Possible RF grounding interference. No further investigation due to field constraints." Stack stared at it for a long time. RF grounding interference. The phrasing was crude, but the idea, a wiring-induced radar signature reduction, sounded eerily modern. That memo triggered an internal inquiry. Engineers ran simulations using surplus B-24 panels, grounding them in different ways. To their astonishment, some setups reduced reflected radar energy by up to 12 decibels. The same number Hank had calculated by hand with a pencil stub and a notebook 15 years earlier. The data was undeniable. It became classified under a new program, Radar Scattering Reduction, Passive Conductive Control. It would later feed directly into Project Oxcart and have Blue, the foundations of stealth design. But no one remembered the mechanic who started it. Hank had left the service in 1946, drifting between factory jobs. He never talked about his work at Hardwick. When asked about the war, he'd just say, "I fixed planes so other men could make it home." The irony was perfect. He'd built the first Shadow and lived like one. In 1961, an Air Force historian tracked him down in Tulsa to verify old maintenance rosters. When the man mentioned radar research, Hank chuckled. "You boys still chasing reflections?" he asked. The historian smiled. "You could say that." Hank's hands were still scarred from solder burns. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small coil of aged copper wire, dark and stiff. "That's the one they banned," he said. "Killed more rules than radar ever did." The historian asked what it did. Hank smiled faintly. It confused the echo, made it think it was looking at fog. No record of that conversation made it into the archives. But 3 years later, engineers at Lockheed Skunk Works independently rediscovered his principle while developing radar-absorbent coatings for the A-12. Their findings matched the Hardwick anomaly within 2%. They called it resonance cancellation. Hank had called it silence. In the physics of war, his discovery didn't look like genius. It looked like error, a short circuit in logic. But every breakthrough starts as a mistake someone refuses to undo. And that was Hank Lowry's legacy, a band connection that turned chaos into clarity, noise into protection. The Air Force never honored him. There was no medal for the man who broke the rule book to save others. But inside the engineering logs of early stealth prototypes, one footnote appears over and over again. Field observation. Conductive isolation reduces cross-section response. The engineers who wrote that had no idea they were echoing a line from Hank's 1944 notebook. Silence makes us harder to find. The difference between luck and science is measurement. Hank never had instruments or formulas. He had instinct. And instinct told him that invisibility wasn't about making metal vanish. It was about making energy lose interest. Radar had been built on the arrogance that everything metal must be seen. Hank proved that arrogance wrong with a single wire. He wasn't trying to outsmart radar. He was just trying to make a broken circuit behave. But in doing so, he created something the world wouldn't name until decades later. Stealth. He'd been the first man to make a machine disappear, and to understand that sometimes the best defense isn't armor, it's uncertainty. When Henry Hank Lowry died in 1974, there was no ceremony, no folded flag, no speeches. His service records listed him as an aircraft electrician, honorable discharge, no combat distinctions. His gravestone read only, Henry Lowry, 1918 to 1974, fixed planes. It was almost poetic. He had fixed more than planes. By then, the world had moved on to jet-age wonders. Radar domes, guided missiles, and composite aircraft that could vanish from screens by design, not accident. But buried in the blueprints of America's stealth revolution, under layers of secrecy and patents, lay the same humble principle Hank had stumbled on with a soldering iron and a stubborn streak. Misalignment saves lives. In 1981, when the F-117 Nighthawk made its first radar tests, engineers measured its cross-section at less than 0.01 square meters. They called it a miracle of geometry and materials science. But inside the classified briefing, one analyst pointed out something fascinating. The aircraft's internal wiring had been rerouted to prevent resonance between the electrical grid and the airframe. He wrote, "The internal structure functions as a distributed ground isolator, similar to anomalies recorded in certain Wave 2 bomber reports." RAF Hardwick. Nobody in the room knew what Hardwick meant. The footnote died in obscurity. Somewhere, perhaps in a rusted box, Hank's logbook still exists. The final page, according to his daughter, was written in his shaky handwriting a year before he died. "If you can't stop the storm, confuse it. That's all electricity ever does. It dances until someone stops watching." He had never considered himself an inventor. He'd never heard the word stealth. All he wanted was silence, a radio that didn't scream when the engine started. But sometimes history hides its revolutions inside ordinary men who never get the memo that they changed something. In a war ruled by formulas and bureaucracy, Hank had done what the best minds hadn't dared. He listened to the hum of his machines instead of the words in a manual. He discovered what engineers would later put into equations: that every reflection has a weakness. Every echo can be distracted, and even light itself can be fooled by a little bit of disorder. When Vera Lynn vanished from German radar in 1944, she didn't turn invisible. She became a question the enemy couldn't answer, and that's what Hank Lowry gave the world. The idea that confusion could be a shield. He never patented it, he never published it. But 50 years later, his fingerprint was still there, ghosting across every stealth aircraft that took to the sky, from the Nighthawk to the B-2 Spirit. He had turned one band repair into the cornerstone of modern warfare. Not by defiance, not by luck, but by listening. The next time you hear the phrase invisible to radar, remember, invisibility didn't begin in a laboratory. It began in a freezing English hangar, with a grease-stained mechanic who looked at a piece of wire and thought, what if silence could protect us? And in that silence, the hum of electricity, the pause between echoes, the first shadow was born.